this event and putting together such an incredible panel today. I'm going to start with a quick round of introductions for our speakers today. We have Paul Angelo, a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. We also have Juan Fernando Cristo, a well-known figure for those of you who follow Colombian politics. He served as Minister of Interior during the presidency of Juan Manuel Santos and was senator from 1998 to 2014. We also have Elizabeth Dickinson, who we call Beth, our senior analyst in Colombia for the International Crisis Group, and also Adriana Mejia, who's the Vice Minister for Multilateral Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Relations, a position she also held from 2006 to 2019. The topic that gathers us today is the assassination of social leaders in Colombia, an issue which we examine in our most recent report produced by Crisis Group. But as we dedicate today some time to this crucial problem, we must also understand it in the wider context of what's happening in Colombia today. 4 years after the signing of the peace agreement between the FARC and the Colombian state, we must acknowledge that peace in the country is struggling. A central cause of today's violence is the struggle of armed criminal groups to consolidate their influence over territories previously controlled by FARC. Where once we had large swaths of the territory controlled by this guerrilla group, we are now seeing an explosion of smaller armed actors, led mostly by greed more than ideology, fighting to fill the power void left by the FARC when they demobilized. These battles are obviously also the product of the difficulties that the Colombian state has had historically to secure control over the entire territory. After the FARC demobilized, the state was unable to come into those regions and secure the state's monopoly of the use of force. And the violence is also the result of the expansion of illicit economies, coca for sure, but also illegal mining and logging, among others. Unfortunately, the question of rural development remains at the center of Colombians' troubles. Point 1 of the accord with the FARC gave us a map on how to move forward on this issue, but its very limited implementation and the problems that are plaguing programs such as the voluntary crop eradication one have not allowed the country to do the needed progress on these issues. As our report explains, attacks against community leaders are not new in Colombia, but this has become a salient political issue and is used by many as an indicator of the serious challenges facing the peace process and peace in general. As Beth will explain later in detail, we argue in our report that there is no centralized plan to exterminate all leaders and that many of these murders can only be understood as the result of micro-contests determined by the conditions of where leaders operate. However, there is a motive behind the growing assassination of leaders that has a clear political motivation: to silence communities and those who speak out to defend their rights. The violence against leaders can also not be disconnected from other worrisome signs, such as the increase of massacres. We have had 67 this year alone, and the growing number of FARC ex-combatants that are murdered. So in a context where COVID has magnified tensions that have long existed, Colombia has many challenges ahead. However, we really believe that all political actors in Colombia right now are invested in addressing these murders and implementing effective policies that stop the bloodshed. We hope that recommendations in the report and conversations such as the one that we're having today will help all stakeholders come up with concrete ways forward with the urgency that the situation requires. So I now turn to Michael, who will moderate the session. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and happy to answer any questions that you might have at the end. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Renata. Congratulations again on the excellent report. I think it gives us a great starting point for today's conversation. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. It's really a privilege for us to be able to partner with Crisis Group for today's discussion on such a pressing issue, and to do so with such a terrific group of speakers. So welcome again to everyone to this conversation. Before we jump in, just a couple of logistical notes. You can follow this event on Twitter at #ColombiaDefenders, at Crisis Group, and at The Dialogue. We do invite participants to submit questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, the event hashtag on Twitter, or to email questions to meetings@thedialogue.org. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to jump in and moderate a conversation with our terrific speakers. We will reserve time, as I mentioned at the end, to take questions from the audience. So let me start with Beth Dickinson from Crisis Group. Beth, again, congratulations on the report, Leaders Under Fire, Defending Colombia's Front Line of Peace, which I commend to all our viewers for further insight on this issue. The report details, obviously, the alarming rate of violence against social leaders in Colombia in the wake of the 2016 peace accord. I think the obvious questions which Renata began to speak to are, why is this happening and who's behind it? And I'd love to have your perspective on those questions, but maybe as kind of a preliminary matter, you could tell us, who are these leaders? What kind of role do they play in their community, and why is it so important? Why does it matter so much that they're being targeted for violence?
Thank you so much again, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So social leaders, I think, in Colombia is a group of people that there's no confirmed definition, but what we can say is that they are individuals who work in defending the rights of the communities that they represent. So this can be a whole diversity of causes. And I think this is one of the reasons that the concept of a social leader can be difficult to grab onto, but they're essentially figures who worked for the social cohesion of the group that they represent. It can be at a department level, a state level, or it can be all the way down to the level of a neighborhood, say a street or one or two streets in an area. These are individuals, for example, such as a group of mothers who would work together to prevent child recruitment of those in the neighborhood into armed groups. It could be ethnic groups protecting their autonomy, the Indigenous Guard, for example. It could be a group of youth fighting for the right for safe spaces after school, or any such cause. It could be a group of environmentalists. And social leaders, I think one of the reasons that they're so important, first of all, because they're really the voices who are able to speak out and who dare to speak out in a situation and a context of fear. Often, social leaders are the individuals, and often the only individuals in a community who have come forward to say, this isn't right. I defend my community's right against what's happening here. That could be the manifestations of armed groups or environmental damage. They are the voices who speak up, and as such, they are the thorns in the side of invested interests in the areas where they live. So that those interests could be armed groups, they could be environmental projects, all sorts of an agglomeration really of interests. To understand, I think, who's killing these leaders and why, a place to start, I think, is really actually the why question. So I think one of the points that we try to make in the report, and I think is key to understanding the way that violence is happening and why it's important, is really to see the killing of social leaders as a modality of violence used to silence an entire community. It's almost sort of an efficiency that's come from historical legacies of the conflict, that instead of using violence against an entire population, say of victims or an ethnic group or a particular community, targeting the single individual who symbolically represents them can be just as effective as silencing the entire resistance that they represent. So as such, the killings of social leaders have a symbolism and a political importance that far transcends sort of what we can say as regular criminal homicides. As such, this comes in a history in Colombia of using social control as a means to territorial control. What do I mean by that? The armed groups that are fighting to control various pockets of Colombia today, what they're after, above all, is control over land, territory, corridors, illicit economies. But how do they do that? They do that by controlling the population that's based there. And the most efficient way to do that, again, is to target the leaders who represent those communities. So this matters to Colombia because it's essentially an indicator on the surface that indicates the violence that's happening, not just against individuals who are leaders who are in a prominent position, but against entire pockets of the country that they represent. In a sense, it's an indicator of the intimidation and the coercion that is being exerted against these communities on the ground in Colombia. And I think this is one of the reasons that many in the Colombian public have clung onto this indicator as a means to test How are we doing in terms of consolidating peace in Colombia? And social leaders, because of the role they play, the violence against them tells us that there are alarming trends that we need to pay attention to. Who is killing the social leaders? Here, when we look at statistics from the Attorney General's office, who is responsible for attributing responsibility, we can see that a plurality of murders are attributed to armed groups. And among them, the FARC dissidents are a very prominent group among them. But a very significant number of these murders are also attributed to individuals. And what that essentially tells us is that there's a very intricate web of interests that are probably somewhere behind those individuals who are the intellectual authors of the crimes that are very difficult to disarticulate. A small group of murders, I think it's just 2 out of about 200 cases that have been advanced by the Fiscalia, by the Attorney General's office, were attributed to members of the armed forces. Again, what does this tell us? Social leaders are the thorns in the side of interests who are trying to control a territory. In many cases today in Colombia, these are illicit actors, criminal actors, armed groups. But there are other interests and other economic interests and historical interests in the country that also see social leaders as a threat. And this has contributed to the trend of violence against them.
Terrific. Thanks, Beth. I think that's a great place to start the conversation. Let me turn to Vice Minister Mejia. Vice Minister, thank you for joining us. The crisis group report acknowledges both the government's political will to protect social leaders, as well as specific efforts such as the provision of state security measures to some 5,000 of these social leaders. But the report also argues that the government's understanding of the killings as unconnected to political motivations, as connected exclusively to criminal interests, is too narrow, and that it limits ultimately the effectiveness of the government's response. So let me ask you, in the Duque administration's view, how serious is the violence against social leaders? Why are they being killed? And what should be done to stop it?
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, and thank you again for having me. I'm very pleased to be here with you, sharing this space where we can discuss with the facts one of the greatest challenges that we are facing currently and working tirelessly to confront regarding the security of social leaders and human rights defenders, as well as FARC ex-combatants. Despite the challenges that we are facing, such as the human rights violations perpetrated by organized armed groups and the illicit economies that most often fuel them and cause them, is also a democracy that has consolidated and in unequivocal consensus to the effect that there is no political or ideological cause that justifies murdering, kidnapping, or any other expression of crime or of violence. The government has strongly condemned these attacks against social leaders and human rights defenders. And moreover, it has taken decisive actions to assist and protect those in danger. In order to address this issue and as comprehensively as possible, we need to begin by recognizing the source of the phenomenon. I think the diagnosis that Elizabeth has presented before us just a few minutes ago is quite accurate. We have identified 3 risk factors that affect the population in general, and human rights defenders and social leaders in particular. Those are the escalation of competition between illegal armed groups and criminal organizations for the control of different illegal economies. Obviously, drug trafficking, illegal mining, but also human trafficking, also contraband, also arms trafficking. The second risk factor would be the slow stabilization in areas where the FARC guerrillas exercise their influence, bearing in mind that the process of the implementation of the final agreement signed in 2016 was estimated to take 15 years. The government is committed to fulfilling its part, obviously working on setting the most important basis for the fulfillment of the agreement as a long-term policy. But changes do not occur from one day to the other. And the third risk factor is the unprecedented expansion of illicit crops during the 6 years that were prior to the current administration in Colombia. We cannot forget that from 2013 to 2017, we experienced the highest increase of illicit crop cultivation in Colombia in history since we have measured this phenomenon. There is a direct correlation between the presence of these three risk factors and the national geography and the concentration of violence and threats against vulnerable communities. I appreciate and value the way that Elizabeth expressed what social leaders represent to communities, and would add an additional meaning to the number of social leaders in Colombia. Since 2016, when the Attorney General's office established its special investigation unit, we used a measurement indicator by which we established 23 indicators to define what qualifies a person as a social leader in Colombia. If we add up these 23 indicators, this would amount to a population of almost 8 million people in Colombia who have or could be defined as social leaders. This is almost the same population as Bogota, and they are dispersed throughout the Colombian territory. So you can understand what a challenge it represents to protect a population of 8 million people dispersed all across our geography. I would also add something to what Elizabeth said, and disagree with the fact that she intended to say that this has some political meaning behind it. The Duque administration understands that there is nothing to do with partisan confrontations, as the most serious and rigorous investigations have shown that those behind these atrocious violations of human rights are organized armed groups and drug trafficking groups. So we don't esteem that there is any political meaning behind these attacks. This is nothing new. The government is fully aware that drug trafficking has historically been the fuel for violence in Colombia. Multiple challenges arise from the illicit crops cultivation, as well as the production, processing, and manufacturing and trafficking of narcotics. And this has been going on since the 1980s. The government has amassed all efforts to work on an ambitious plan that offers sustainable livelihood solutions for citizens that quit their participation in this illicit business and decided to join the National Substitution Plan. But I think we can expand on this in the coming questions. So thank you again, Michael, and thank you to my fellow panelists.
Great, thank you, Vice Minister. Indeed, we will return, I think, to many of those themes. So thank you very much for those comments. Minister Cristo, let me turn to you. As the Vice Minister mentioned, some of these trends, including the trend of killing of social leaders, is not a new one. Dates to prior years before the Duque administration, including to the years of the Santos administration and the peace negotiations in which you served, and you were a protagonist. So let me ask you, based on your experience at the time as Minister of Interior, what was your understanding during the Santos administration about the reasons for this phenomenon, for this surge and killings of social leaders? Did you attribute it, as the Vice Minister suggested, at least in part to the expansion of coca cultivation in the country? And why do you think that both the Santos and the Duque administrations have struggled to respond to this violence? Ministro, I think we're trying to get you off mute.
Okay.
There we go.
Hello, Michael. Sorry. Thanks for having me. I have a problem with my computer. This is not my computer, so it's a new experience with that. Thanks very much, and it's my pleasure to be here with these fellows. And let me begin saying that the social leaders assassinations in Colombia is not new, of course. We have been this kind of crimes for decades. There is a difference during the time. In the 19th, the phenomenon was more urban and related to human rights defenders. And the perpetrators at that time were closely linked to paramilitary groups and army officers. In recent years, murders have been taking place in rural areas, in remote areas, very remote areas. This is very important to know. And the victims are community leaders. So the phenomenon has been changing during the last 2 or 3 decades. This situation was anticipated in the peace talks with the FARC. We knew at that time that we will have this problem after the peace agreement. That's why we had an entire chapter devoted to the protection measures in the territories, which included the creation, for instance, the creation of a National Commission for Protection and Security, presided by the President of the Republic. This National Commission, this government only has, they have had 1 or 2 sessions during these 2 years. Also, we created a collective program for the protection of the community, and also a special unit in the Attorney Office in order to dismantling the criminal organization. I repeat that it's very clear that we knew that this phenomenon will increase in a very specific areas of the country. We have to say that the things are, these instruments that we created in the peace agreement, unfortunately, haven't been implemented by the government, by the current government. And I would say that the murders cannot be attributed for a single cause, and the perpetrators are also diverse. We cannot reduce this phenomenon only to the illicit crops and the traffic and the drug traffic. This is a wrong vision of the problem. We have now that the perpetrators, they assassinate environmental defenders. In fact, Colombia has today the world highest number of leaders assassinated, the environmental defenders, community activities, and those involved in the social substitution of illicit crops, and also whose work against the illegal mining. This is a very important issue today in Colombia. They are killed for criminal groups like the Clan del Golfo, Los Pelusos, several criminal bands, but also they are killing for the dissidents from the FARC, also for the ELN, and also for the mafias of land robbers. Now we are seeing also the political violence coming back. This is a very critical situation, and we have to work together against this new political violence in Colombia. In fact, this week we had 3 members of the Colombia Humana, the main political party in the opposition, who were killed, and we don't know until now who are killing them. So we need to be clear. It is the non-integral implementation of the peace agreement that has led to this situation today. And not like some people from the government and also from his party is telling the public opinion that this is because of the peace agreement. This is a wrong approximation to the problem. In more than 2 years, in these 2 years of the government, we have another problem in the territories. The ELN and the dissidents from the FARC, they are growing in the municipalities. We pass from 55 municipalities with dissidents of the FARC presence in 2018 to more than 100 today. And in the case of the ELN, we passed from 92 municipalities to more than 175 municipalities. This is a problem. And the non-integral implementation in issues like the rural reform, the seats for the victims in the 16 zones created, which we call PEDETs, Territorial Development Plans, the substitution of illegal crops, and the security measures, as I pointed before, this lack of implementation is a problem for the people in the territories. Mainly in 6 of 5 territories in Colombia, in 6 of 5 areas, we are having this problem of the assassination, especially Cauca, Nariño, Chocó, Catatumbo in the border with Venezuela, norte de Santander, and in Antioquia, the Bajo Cauca Antioqueño. And I will say to you that there is one additional paradox. The government not only doesn't implement the peace agreement, but also they have been successful in its main official speech, the improvement of the security in the country. That's why the dissidents from the FARC and the people from the ELN, these groups are growing right now in these areas where we have this problem of the assassination. Finally, I would like to respond to this suggestion that this phenomenon is not different than what happened in the Santos administration. We designed the instruments to prevent and minimize the risks of this situation. We agree with the FARC to look for a national pact against the violence. We haven't been developed. We stood by the communities and we condemn the crimes in a very energetic way. We work with the civil society in order to take the measures in each territory. And the problem today is that the government does not even condemn a killing anymore. I am very worried because this kind of killings today, we have one crime in Chocó, one crime in Cauca, and the government and the official of the government, they, since 4 or 5 months ago, they are not condemning this kind of crimes, which means that the attitude is totally different. We need today a country united, all the country, government and opposition, condemning this kind of crimes, because the social leaders are the main voice of the people in a territories that we are talking about, they are living there in the 175 municipalities where we have this problem. They are the voices of these communities. The mafias, the drug traffickers, the illegal minor mafias, they are killing the life and the voices of these communities.
Terrific. Thank you, Minister Cristo. Again, I think we'll come back to many of those themes, including the status of peace process implementation, its impact on this issue. Let me turn to Paul Angelo from CFR to pick up some of these ideas. Paul, you worked on several occasions in Colombia, including closely with the police and the military of Colombia during your time as a naval officer deployed to the US Embassy in Bogota. The crisis group report faults the Colombian government for failing to fill the security vacuum created by FARC demobilization, but also for an overly militarized strategy that prioritizes goals like coca eradication over the protection of communities. As you know very well, discussions about how to bring state presence and rule of law to conflict-afflicted rural communities in Colombia are debates and discussions that have been going on for a long time. I'd be interested in your assessment of how the Colombian government is doing on this front as a general matter, and then more specifically its response to the threats and persistent violence against social leaders. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me today. I'd first like to congratulate both Beth and Renata on what is a very comprehensive, accurate, and fair report. And as you correctly note, Michael, among the disappointments of the 2016 peace accords, the Colombian security forces' inability to fill the void or reclaim territory that was ceded by the FARC is, for me, the most perplexing. And this doesn't have a sort of a partisan label to it. Both the Santos and Duque administrations failed to fill that security vacuum. A place that I visited for my own research in 2017 was Ituango, one of the pellets that was actually vacated by FARC, demobilized FARC members, and they're leaving the area was facilitated by the Colombian military, which to me signals a recognition that the Colombian military and police are unable to provide for security, even in the pellets, which are the priority zones for the provision of security. And so it should come as no surprise that groups like the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia or the ELN are thriving in these areas today. The ICG report calls this the original sin of the peace accords, and from my perspective, it was the cornerstone. And that initial failure to reclaim that territory points to why rural violence and why the assassination of social leaders is so problematic and so high today. And the story that the numbers tell is a troubling one. While decades of armed conflict have been put to rest, the Colombian state continues to struggle with the provision of citizen security. 2020 is on track to be the most dangerous year for social activists in the past decade. I'm not exactly sure. I think the latest number that I saw was 166 activists killed about halfway through the year. But it looks like we're on pace to overtake the figures from 2018, which was an election year. And everyone who knows Colombia knows that election years tend to be more violent. But discrepancies exist, and as the Vice Minister's comments note, the definition of what constitutes a social leader varies between civil society, both international and domestic to Colombia, and the figures that are used by the Colombian government. INDEPAS, which is a leading human rights organization in Colombia, places the figure at about 970 human rights defenders and social leaders who have been killed since 2016, averaging 240 per year. But the Colombian presidency points to a figure that there are only 366 such victims. So I think that, unfortunately, the Colombian government has attempted to minimize these numbers or minimize the drama by insisting that the definition of a social leader is too broad, or that many social leaders who are vulnerable do not seek state protection. And if that latter point is true, then it is incumbent on the Colombian government to create the conditions so that individuals who are at risk do feel empowered to make this ask of their government. Trust is a two-way street, but I do believe the Colombian government needs to show leadership here. And we've also seen recently an uptick in rural massacres, as Beth mentioned in her comments, with, I believe we had 67 this year. with more than 230 people killed in these incidents. The rhetoric surrounding this kind of violence has been disconcerting. President Duque has referred to these as collective homicides rather than massacres, which is a more clinical name for a wave of tragedy. And the recent spate also demonstrates the geographic reach of insecurity across Colombia, while the victims of the profile of the victims of these massacres demonstrate that no one is immune to violence in much of Colombia's countryside. So now that the Colombian government is facing a crisis on all sides, you've got economic downturn, a public health catastrophe, waves of violence, and growing social unrest. I think it's time for the Colombian government to change course when it comes to its relations with social movements and social mobilization in the country. As we speak, the Minga, which I'm sure we'll also talk about, seeks dialogue with Bogota, and to date, President Duque has neglected to meet with the protesters, citing concerns about COVID. This reluctance is emblematic, from where I sit, of a broader distrust of social mobilization and even civil society in Colombia. The fact that the government has cast doubt on the credibility of statistics or data collection methods of NGOs. When we saw protests in September, some of which turned violent in urban spaces, representatives of the government deemed this the work of ELN infiltrators. So I just think across the board that the Colombian government needs to be cautious about employing rhetoric that criminalizes social mobilization. Sending a Black Hawk to monitor social mobilization from the air tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the state of government-citizen relations in Colombia today. As the Vice Minister also mentioned, in many cases, it's an instance of organized crime that's posing the greatest threat to vocal social leaders. And as Minister Cristo notes, you have environmentalists, activists who are speaking out against the extractive industry or illicit activities, who are the principal targets of this campaign of violence and intimidation. In other instances, you have individuals who are insisting on the implementation of the 2011 Ley de Víctimas. And to that point, I would just offer that there is a political motive behind this violence and behind the assassination of social leaders. In Colombia, land is politics. That's always been the case. And to downplay the political motives behind the wave of violence that we're seeing does a disservice to both to the victims, but also to negotiating successfully a way out of this wave of violence. And I would just sort of close now in saying that when I worked in Colombia during the Uribe administration, I worked very intimately with an initiative called Acción Integral, which represented a human security approach to Colombia's armed conflict, seeking to address the root causes of conflict, such as inequality, poverty, marginalization. We saw, in particular, I worked consistently in the Pacific, in Tumaco, and we saw actually real gains being made during the years that I was working there, because there was a concerted effort on part of the various ministries and agencies of the Colombian government that were supported by the agencies of the US government to really reclaim the periphery and restore the rule of law, or in some cases, introduce the rule of law to far-flung places or territories in Colombia. But my sense is that a lot of those gains have been lost, and the attempt at consolidation, which began under the Uribe administration, continued throughout the Santos administration, has fallen short. Today, in many regions of Colombia, the only face that the citizenry experience of the state is the state's repressive face. And you see that with the forced eradication, the reluctance to implement point 4 of the peace accords, which focus on crop substitution and voluntary manual eradication. And the rhetoric coming out of the Duque administration about it returning to the use of glyphosate and aerial spraying further undermines the credibility of the government to, in the long run, implement a more sustainable approach to reducing coca crop cultivation in the Colombian countryside. So I think that the Duque administration should more carefully strike the balance between of a fair application of the 2016 peace accords, while acknowledging that the rampant illegality, criminality, and the focus on land possession in the Colombian countryside continue to pose great threats to social leadership. Certainly a greater threat than Castro Chavismo or demobilized combatants from the FARC. The peace accords of 2016 have already been litigated. They've passed through the Constitutional Court and the Congress. So it would be wise to expend that effort on addressing the dire security situation in the countryside.
Thanks, Paul. Terrific. I think you covered a lot of ground, and I think spoke with a lot of experience to many of the issues that have been raised in the conversation so far. I want to expand the discussion to include some of the really interesting issues that have been raised, but I think it's important to drill down on this issue of kind of causality and especially the political versus criminal kind of nature of the violence we're seeing against social leaders, which has been I think a point of discussion among the panelists so far. So Beth, let me turn to you first of all on this point. The report acknowledges the fragmented and often localized nature of contemporary conflict in Colombia. It's more difficult, more challenging, I think it's fair to say, to explain violence in Colombia today than it might have been 20 years ago, when you had 2 or 3, maybe 4 groups that were very clearly kind of delineated and responsible for the bulk of the violence. Now you have a proliferation of armed criminal groups. You have the ELN, you have dissident FARC, you have local criminal bands. This makes it very difficult, I think, to weave a simple, coherent narrative regarding violence against social leaders, which does emanate from multiple sources. Nevertheless, you were quite explicit, as is the report, in insisting that the violence should be characterized as political. So, could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what you mean by that and why you think it's the case?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, as we see from this really excellent conversation so far, there is very broad agreement across Colombia's entire conversation that this problem is something that needs to be solved. But where we differ is the diagnoses. And this really gets to the question of whether there is a political nature to this violence or not. So I think a key tension that we try to highlight in the report, and that's key to understanding this question, is this tension between the very fragmented nature of the conflict and the individual context of each crime that's happening, each homicide, and the trends that are happening nationally. So in the context of one individual case, you'll see that it's always in the context of whatever micro dispute is happening in that area. So this could be a micro dispute over trafficking. It could be a micro dispute over recruitment. It could be a micro dispute over the ability to enter indigenous territory from armed groups or not. And every murder, every homicide has to be understood in that context. And for sure, the diversity of those crimes gives the initial impression that it is criminality, because each one is characterized by the specific characteristics of the dispute of that area. However, we have to ask ourselves, if this is the nature of the fragmented conflict and violence reflects that across the country, why is it that social leaders as a group have been targeted more broadly, that they have been disproportionately affected by this violence that has taken place since the 2016 Accord? Why is it that in a given locality, a social leader is much more vulnerable to this expression of violence than a regular citizen on the street? And here I think the key point is really to look not so much at the individual crimes and their motives, because today in Colombia, there is no singular plan to exterminate social leaders. There's no one man or one group making a list of social leaders to kill. No, it's a very different context today. But what there is that is common across national trends are patterns of victimization. The patterns of victimization tell us that leaders as a group are disproportionately affected because of the work that they do. Why because of the work that they do? Because, as we mentioned in the beginning, these are the individuals who will speak up against whatever group or whatever interest is attempting to impose itself on a community. So by silencing those leaders, you are silencing the entire community. Paul said it very well. Land is politics in Colombia. So by trying to control a territory, armed groups will seek social control. The way that they seek social control is by attacking social leaders particularly. So now we have territorial control, social control, and what is politics if not control of the land and the society in a given area? That is politics. So these armed groups, these actors who are carrying out these crimes, they may not have a political agenda in the sense of, I want to go to Bogota and I want to change this, this, and this, and raise taxes. And it's not like that. The politics that they want to install is very localized, it's very specific, and it's about controlling a given area with a set of rules that are their own, that are imposed with coercion and force. This is targeted violence, and it is political in its context. And we have to see nationally that these patterns indicate that even if those politics are micro and local, all politics is local, right, as they say, that it is a national problem across areas. And so I think that would be our diagnosis of the problem. And that's important to understand, because if we understand this context of the political nature of the crimes, we come up with very different solutions than if we only see it as a criminal problem. Where as a criminal problem, we might look to, say, disarticulate a group, seize their assets, take over whatever trafficking they're doing. Whereas if it's a political problem, we have to look much deeper. We have to say, what is it about what's happening in this given area that's causing this violence to persist? That even if we take away the 10 top members of whatever armed group we're dealing with, it suddenly regenerates. What is it that is making this cycle of violence so perpetual? And what is doing that is the political nature of these crimes, I think would be the key argument from our diagnosis to understand this problem.
Thanks, Beth. I think, precisely for that reason, it's important to dwell on this issue. And I want to turn back to the Vice Minister, essentially on the same question, Vice Minister, from the government's perspective, what is the information that's being used to assess the actors and the motives involved in these killings of social leaders, and come up with a diagnosis that's a little bit different. And I also want to give you a chance to respond to the suggestion that the government is somehow minimizing the issue in terms of the rhetoric it's using around massacres, lack of condemnation of some of these assassinations. If you could speak to both the question on causes, as well as the specific concern about minimization on the part of the government.
Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. And it's an excellent question, because here I would really like to pose an invitation to my fellow panelists that we discuss this issue with intellectual honesty. I think it's very easy to signal rhetorics when we are very, very much aware that a narrative is intended to be installed on the part of the opposition in Colombia, that much of this violence is attributable to the lack of implementation of the agreement that was signed in 2016. That is to absolutely ignore the causes of structural violence in Colombia that date to the 1970s. It is very naive to pretend that agreement signed in 2016 with one armed group that surely represented a very significant amount of violence in Colombia would, from one day to the other, magically cure the phenomenon when structural causes remained in place, such as narco-trafficking and, as I mentioned, the historic increase of the cultivation of illicit crops between 2013 and 2017. So the government condemns violence, and it condemns it every day. President Duque was just yesterday in Chocó, putting his leadership with all the military and the police commanders, facing the very, very grave situation that we have there. He has been in Catatumbo, he has been in Nariño, he has been in all the places in the geography where this violence is increasing, and obviously all the members of his team, all the members of government are very gravely concerned, and we condemn this violence every day that it happens. So just to invite the opposition to have a discussion in intellectual honesty and disregard the fact that we are at opposite places of our ideology, but we all strive to build a better country. Just to mention some of the questions that were posed, what is the motivation behind these crimes? It is not for the government to say. We have in place a very, very serious special unit of investigation at the Attorney General's office, which was in fact put in place, as I mentioned before, in 2016. This was not a product of the peace agreement. It was an autonomous decision by the Attorney General at the time to establish this special unit of investigation to be able to identify the root causes of violence against social leaders. And as a matter of fact, this is the year in which this term was defined to start investigations in these attacks. This special unit of investigation has been able to solve 59% of these crimes, which is more or less 25% more than the crimes that occur against current normal citizens in the country. And it has also concluded so far that 69% of these crimes were perpetrated by criminal groups. This is not a statistic that the government has produced. It is produced by the Attorney General's office. As all of you know, this is an independent and autonomous institution from the executive branch of government. The Attorney General's office has also prioritized 11 territorial entities, among them many of those that were mentioned by Minister Cristo and by Paul. Among these are Nariño, Cauca, Antioquia, and Arauca. In light of internationally settled standards of due diligence, the Attorney General's office has also implemented a first hypothesis methodology, which such approach enables prosecutors to prioritize the hypothesis that the motive behind the homicide of a social leader was his or her labor of human rights defense. This includes obviously environmental leaders. And specifically, prosecutors must assess the following information. First, whether the event occurred due to the victim's role as a human rights defender. 2, the role of the social leader played in the community. 3, the agenda developed by the social leader. And 4, the area in which he or she carried out his or her activities. Concerning whether the assessment varies in different zones of the country, the Attorney General's office is currently implementing this strategy with territorial approach, which acknowledges the wide heterogeneity existence across the Colombian territory by taking into account those factors that vary from region to region: geography, demographics, risks, special features of the crime, cultural conditions, and social circumstances. So in no way is the government or the state institutions ignoring the value that social leaders play. And as a matter of fact, this is the main source of the investigation, and all the police and all the institutions are working hand in hand with the Attorney General's office to be able to clarify and condemn these crimes, take those responsible to justice, and ensure that there will be no impunity. Those are my comments.
Terrific. Thank you, Vice Minister. It's very, very clear, and thank you for speaking to those issues so succinctly. Minister Cristo, let me loop back to the peace process implementation issue that's come up a few times, and the Vice Minister just mentioned it as well. I think many people, and this is the case also with the crisis group's report, have pointed to peace process implementation or the lack thereof as a source or an explanation for violence against social leaders. I think we heard from the Vice Minister that the view that that's an oversimplified, at the least, explanation for what we're seeing in terms of a phenomenon that goes back much further in time, and structural causes of violence that are much older in Colombia. But let me ask you for your view on this. How important do you think peace process implementation is in this story? Imagine a world in which the peace process, the peace accord, were fully, perfectly implemented. How would life be different for social leaders? Would we not still have criminal organizations, illicit economies, some of the factors that have been identified here as sources of violence against these social leaders?
Okay, Michael, let's say we have very focalized 5 or 6 areas in Colombia where we have the problem, and this very big problem. If you see the statistics about violence in Colombia, the peace agreement, now shows that the violence is going down in almost everywhere in Colombia, in many areas of the country. But we have this problem concentrated in these 5 or 6 areas, very specific. I have the first worry I have is that, and I have to point out that in these areas are the areas where we have more presence of the army, of the states. So deployed in these areas. So we are not doing very well in the fight against the perpetrators and the intellectual authors of these massacres or these killings of social leaders. This is the first thing I would say to do. The second point, it would be totally different in these areas if we had the implementations full in the areas. That's why in the peace agreement, Michael, we created what we call the PEDETs, the 16 zones in the 117 municipalities most affected by the conflict in the history of Colombia during the last 15 years. I agree with the Vice Minister, and I must be clear that these killings didn't begin on 7 August of 2018. We have had this killing during the last 40 years. And of course, I agree also that it cannot be changed one day by the other, of course. But it will be the totally different the situation in these areas. There will be, if we had the implementation in these areas in the way that it was agreed in the peace accords, there will be a greater social investment by the national administration in these municipalities, most affected by the violence. We would be advising in titling the properties to the peasants and the formalizations of them. We would have voluntary eradication and social substitution of the illegal crops. We would have also 16 spokespersons for these territories in the Congress, demanding for life, demanding for peace, and demanding for the implementation of the peace agreement. And also, we would have a climate of greater understanding of the implementation. That's, I would say that the verbal violence will decrease if we had the full implementation of the agreement. And the violence would be neutralized. Many of these groups, of these violent groups, all around these 5 or 6 areas in Colombia, see the attitude and the speech of some, I wouldn't say people from the government, but I would say people from the government party. This kind of talk, of speech of these people, of course, is the violent groups in these areas. They see that as a kind of opportunity to attack the social leaders who defend the peace agreement. That's the problem of the polarization, of the radicalization of the speech, of the language in these areas. It's different when you say these kind of things in Bogota, in Cali, or Medellin, and which is the effect in Nariño, in Chocó, in the Catatumbo. We have a problem, and that's why we need, at least in terms in the issue of the killings of the social leaders, some kind of national agreement, national pact, in order to fight against the violence together. It's impossible to have an agreement with the government. They don't want to talk about that in terms of the implementation of the agreement. But at least it's very important for the country, for the Colombians, for the social leader, to have a minimum agreement about this issue of the social leaders.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister Cristo. We're getting some excellent questions from audience. I want to begin turning to those, and specifically, I want to ask Paul Angelo about U.S. policy. But very quickly, Vice Minister Mejia, if you wanted to jump in and just respond quickly to anything the minister said, I think we have time for a quick response, and then I'll turn to Paul.
Thank you very much. Yes, just a couple of things. I would invite also Minister Cristo to make a recollection of where the polarization and the very complex rhetoric started, and that was when previous government signaled citizens to be in favor or against peace in Colombia as part of President Santos' re-election strategy in 2014. So it dates back to then, actually. And those who voted no in the plebiscite, among which I am included, we all wanted peace, and we all want peace, and we all want stabilization, and we all want welfare for our citizens everywhere. The differences were quite specific in terms of what was negotiated, but the government remains very much committed to complying with everything that was established in the law, in the Constitution, and we're delivering. We're not delivering in the terms that were imagined probably in the table of conversations in Havana, but we're delivering in terms of what is established in the law and the Constitution of Colombia. One other thing, it was mentioned that this government has not met with the National Security Guarantees Commission. That is false. It has met on 48 occasions, 5 of which nationally, at the national level, the other 43 regionally. These 5 meetings have taken place approximately 1 each semester. The last one is taking place today. So please don't make these false accusations, because it confuses political opinion and public opinion, and we don't want that. The other thing that was mentioned is that the integral plan for voluntary substitution of illicit crops is not taking place. It is. More than 100,000 families are engaged in it. They have eradicated approximately 41,000 hectares of coca, and they are benefiting from different plans that the government has provided for them since 2018, because none of these resources had been delivered before August 7, 2018. In immediate food assistance payments, more than 73,000 families in 14 departments have received these payments. In comprehensive technical assistance, more than 61,000 families have benefited. In Huerta Casera projects, 60,000 families have benefited. And in productive projects, there have been 8,838 investment plans. I would also like to refer to the PEDETs that were mentioned by Minister Cristo. 2 of these PEDETs were in place when President Duque came to office. The other 14 were subscribed in the first year of President Duque's administration, and they are being fully implemented. More than 200,000 people participated in this community planning process. Those 14 PEDETs were led and propelled by President Duque and Councilor Archila. More than 800 investment plans have been also put in place and are being delivered. And we have ensured significant budget allocated to these 16 regions, both in the 2019 budget, in the 2020 budget, and now in the budget that was approved for next year. The call that Minister Cristo makes for 16 spokespersons to go to Congress with new seats in order to call for peace are, to my personal opinion, insignificant when what we have is 50 million Colombian citizens calling for peace, all united. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Minister Cristo, I imagine you have a response to some of those points, but let's move on. I'll come back to you later if you want to address any of this. You'll have the opportunity. Paul Angelo, one of the questions we received has to do with U.S. policy. So let me turn the conversation there, and maybe ask the question in 2 parts. One is about current U.S. policy. To what extent are U.S. policymakers in the Trump administration on Capitol Hill focused on this issue of assassination of social leaders and implementation of the peace accords more broadly, and looking to the future, especially if there's a change in administration, how do you think a Biden administration may approach this issue? What additional tools, support could the U.S. Provide if it were inclined to Colombia to confront this challenge?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think we have seen interest, particularly from members of Congress, on the issue of assassination of social leaders, less so coming from the executive branch of the United States government. Starting in 2018, we saw a series of letters being issued to members of the Trump administration from mostly Democratic members of Congress. There was a recent letter I think July of this year. 94 members of Congress sent a letter to Secretary of State Pompeo asking him to put pressure on the Colombian government to address the surging killings of social leaders. And one of the organizers or authors of the letter, Congressman McGovern of Massachusetts, accused the Colombian government of not doing enough to combat the rise in violence, and also called out the Duque administration for downplaying statistics, which is something that we've touched on today. So we are seeing some attention to this coming from members of the Democratic Party here in Washington. I would just note that in 2016, when bipartisan members of Congress and the Obama administration authorized Peace Colombia, it was to implement the peace accords as they were negotiated between the FARC and the Colombian state. And now that the Duque administration has rhetorically turned to a peace with legality implementation of the accords, I think that goes to really undermine the credibility of US engagement on peace implementation. And that's something that we might see called into question if we see a change in administration come 2020. As I said, the current executive branch of the United States government, well, frankly, it tends to be very unidimensional when it comes to US-Colombia relations. In the administration's eyes, Colombia is no longer a peace protagonist, a NATO global partner, an OECD member state, which we had built up a very multidimensional relationship with Colombia over the first 17 years of this century. But instead, I think Colombia is now, unfortunately, almost viewed entirely through the lens of counter-narcotics, which is more reminiscent of what we saw during the war on drugs of the past century. President Trump has even gone as far as to publicly push the Duque administration to continue aerial spraying, and which we know is a violation, firstly, of the spirit of the peace accords, but also we recognize as a potential health risk, public health risk for people who live in areas that have been priority zones for the aerial spraying of coca crops. And even in this realm of U.S.-Colombia relations, I don't see Colombia as much of a protagonist, but rather as part of an equation. I'm part of the Trump administration to battle the Maduro regime in Venezuela, which depends on illicit financing, some of which comes from drug trafficking, to continue its operation and existence. And so, something I am concerned about in U.S.-Colombia relations is the Venezuelanization, I suppose, in which the U.S. government has come to see the U.S.-Colombia relationship through the lens of Venezuela and the Maduro regime, making the addressing of other issues that have historically been so critical to that partnership increasingly difficult. So I'm just concerned in general about the MOPIC focus on drugs to include all the other aspects that make the U.S.-Colombia relationship so essential to hemispheric leadership. In terms of what we might see with a Biden administration, I would say, security assistance has always been a bipartisan issue in Washington, but it is also, in a bipartisan spirit, also been an issue that's conditioned on human rights respect and the provision of human rights guarantees in the country. And so, I think, Colombia should not necessarily be concerned about a continuation of U.S. aid in partnership if there's a change in administration, but I think that we will see a return to a more multidimensional focus. And I would also just note that foreign policy in general doesn't actually occur in a vacuum, and it tends to reflect the domestic priorities and is sensitive to the views of the U.S. citizenry. And in this vein, I would say that leading voices on the Democratic Party are moving towards a different kind of policing model for U.S. neighborhoods and U.S. communities, one that is more community-oriented and less militarized. And as the Colombian military and Colombian police, as their records are called into question, be it on the basis of falsos positivos or on recent incidents of police brutality, we've seen popular approval of the Colombian security forces drop below 50% for the first time in 20 years. I think sort of a reorientation of the way that security is done in Colombia may be on the table and may be an opportunity for renewed engagement and renewed security assistance, but one this time not focused on a militarized approach, but rather on defense institution building and enhancing transparency mechanisms that contribute overall to Colombia's commitment to democratic governance.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Paul. I'm going to continue with some of the issues and questions that have been raised by our audience members. Beth, let me bring this back to you on the question of responses, solutions, what the government in particular could be doing both in the immediate term and the longer term to better respond to violence against social leaders. And perhaps as part of that, and I'm going to ask you to be fairly brief because we're running short on time, but the Vice Minister spoke specifically about what the Fiscalia is doing, what's happening on voluntary substitution of coca crops. These are issues that the report addresses. So maybe you could speak, to the government's kind of existing response as well as the additional measures that you think are necessary.
Absolutely. So. Let me begin actually by referencing the special investigative unit that the Vice Minister mentioned, because I think here really is an instance of something that is starting to work. And we need to really continue to push and continue to support the effort that is going on there. Essentially, the new methodology that the Attorney General has implemented to link cases, to poke below the surface of cases a bit more, to really devote the resources across different entities within the Attorney General's office, and to ensure that there's a sort of quick team on the ground. These are really vital, I think, to reducing the levels of impunity for these crimes, and again, to put a price tag really on what's happening. Because the impunity rate for homicides generally nationwide has been so low, this has essentially been a low-risk crime for many years. And I think what the Fiscalia has done, and particularly with its special investigations in regional areas to try to find intellectual authors behind numerous cases, is really important to untangling that legacy of impunity. So again, here's something that is working, that we should all, I think, continue to support. In terms of the broader response, I think one of the approaches that's been taken so far, and that is effective in a way, has been individual protection schemes for leaders. So this is ranging everything from giving an endangered leader a flak jacket to a panic button, all the way to having bodyguards and an armored car. So these individual schemes, they're extremely extensive, they're impressive. It's probably one of the most, I think it must be in the world, one of the most extensive protection systems in place, and it has protected individuals. However, I think the argument that we would make is that while that is necessary, particularly in the most at-risk cases, sometimes those individual schemes come at the cost of protecting an entire community. Why? First of all, just because of the suck of resources, right? It takes an enormous amount of resources to protect, as the Vice Minister mentioned, if the number is 8 million leaders in Colombia, that would be really extensive. But secondly, because one of the major parts of many security schemes, of course, not all, but what we hear from leaders is that many leaders who request protection, particularly in remote rural areas, are asked to displace to urban areas where a scheme can really operate comprehensively. Many times the bodyguards and schemes cannot guarantee in a very far-flung area the security of a leader, so they ask them to move to a town nearby. What this essentially does is it takes the leader, who was so key to the social cohesion of that community that's endangered, and removes them from the situation and makes vulnerable that same community that they were representing. So in the act of protecting an individual, we have the unintended side effect, I think, of really rendering that particular area even more vulnerable to violations and violence. And it really can silence the entire community as well, because they no longer have this individual who was threatened, who did stand up there with them. So I think we would urge a shift to thinking more broadly about how to protect communities. That in one sense could be sort of an idea of collective protection. What can you provide to a community to make them feel more safe? What can you do to facilitate their own self-protection mechanisms? But we would also argue for a sort of longer term, and it would be longer term, shift in thinking about what is the security approach that would protect communities in this situation. In an area where an armed group today has control over a territory, the community in many cases is essentially a hostage. They're living under the rules of the armed group, maybe a curfew, limits on who can resupply, who can bring in food. They are essentially trapped within that community. And so what we found is at times the operations of the armed forces that are very much intended to secure the area are thinking more about attacking the armed group than they are about thinking about what will happen to the community if we do this. What are the unintended side effects? What violence could this generate for the people who are living on the ground? I think we would argue for flipping these priorities on their heads. We should think first, what will make this community safer as a whole, which would facilitate not only our need to protect individual leaders, but the entire community that they represent. What would make them safer? And in many cases, I think it would lead to a suggestion of an evolved security model. That thinks a little bit less about offensive operations of armed groups and a little bit more about securing territory as it relates to people. So this, again, would be a very long-term shift, but I think it's one that's vital, both to reducing the load and the burden on the individual protection scheme, and also to ensuring that it's not just individuals that we're thinking about. Of course, these social leaders themselves are important, but also who are the people that they're representing, and who are these, the 50 million Colombians who are living often with the help of social leaders in their individual areas. I think that those would be the starting points for us.
Great. Thanks, Beth. Continuing with the questions we've received, and I think one of them picks up on this last point that you made. Let me turn back to the Vice Minister. Vice Minister, we have a couple of very specific questions about the governments respond. I realize these extend beyond your specific jurisdiction and duties in the foreign ministry, but to the extent you have thoughts that you can share with us on these, I think they're important questions. One has to do with the heavy-handedness of the military and police response, particularly with Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities in Bojayá and the Chocó, which have been criticized by the special representative of the UN Secretary General in Colombia. So if there's any comment on that. And the second has to do with intelligence assets. We've seen, again, recently scandals involving inappropriate targeting of legitimate democratic actors, from magistrates to human rights defenders to opposition political leaders, by intelligence services. The question is, to what extent can you tell us, how extensively are those assets, those intelligence assets, being applied to the legitimate interest in uncovering and understanding the forces behind killing of social leaders? So grateful for any succinct comments on those two specific questions. Thank you.
Yes, Michael, very briefly. Colombian military and police have a constitutional duty to protect all Colombian citizens in the territory, and that is what they do. Any irregular activity, any illicit activity by any member of the Colombian military or police is investigated and punished by the judicial authorities. So in Bojayá, what military and police do is protect citizens, notwithstanding what kind of ethnic group they belong to, and they are there to protect. That is their duty, and that is what we are very grateful for, because they have been under a lot of pressure and under a lot of stress for many decades, and they have actually protected democratic institutions in Colombia from many, many threats. And what has to do with intelligence and surveillance activities that may have been illicit and committed by members of the military, this is also under investigation for the past months. As you know, many of those that have been signaled of being responsible for these illicit activities or presumptive illicit activities have been retired from service, and the investigation is undergoing by the Attorney General's office, which is, again, as I mentioned, an independent branch of power. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you for speaking to those issues. Minister Cristo, we're almost out of time, so maybe I'll give you the final word. And I'd ask you maybe just to give us your view on kind of where we are more broadly. Obviously, today in Bogota, there is a national strike. There's an indigenous Minga specifically in which some of these issues are being raised. We saw them also be prominent in the social protests at the end of last year. So can you give us your sense of how this issue is playing in the Colombian conversation today, how you expect it will continue to play going forward, and any specific recommendations you have or thoughts on how this challenge of assassinations of social leaders can be addressed more effectively, and obviously responding to any of the issues been raised throughout the conversation. Minister Cristo.
First, Michael, let me say to answer the Vice Minister that I am very glad to hear the Vice Minister talking about the implementation of the peace agreement. It's a very good news, Adriana, to hear that, because
I do it often. It happens.
They have been preferring to talk about what they call, in a very strange way, peace with legality. Nobody knows what it means. The peace always is with legality. They prefer to talk about that and not about the implementation of the peace agreement. But even though she is confused about the National Commission for the protection of the people, the combatants, and the social leaders, because maybe Adriana doesn't know that the Ministry of Interior during the last 2 years, each month is creating a new instruments to fight against the violence for the social leaders, and they create some kind of instrument that all the country is confused about what is functioning. And it will be much better to attack this phenomenon just to have the implementation of the agreement. Is that easy? To implementation, the measures that the agreement point out about the National Commission, the unity inside the Attorney General Office, the pact against violence, but they aren't doing that. Also, I would like to say that it's not true that the voluntary programs for the social substitution of illegal crops are advancing. The government has been reducing year by year the budget for this social substitution. They didn't, they stay in the 100 families that the last government left the program. They have not involved more presence in the regions in this kind of social substitution. And in fact, is that because, why are they doing that? Because they prefer, and we all know that the main politic against these illegal crops for this government is not the social substitution. They would prefer the aerial fumigation with glyphosate. As we know, they are intending to do that after the Constitutional Court sentence about 1 year, 1.5 years ago. So that's why that's what I wanted to say about what Vice Minister told before. Now, about the social situation today and the protesters and the march and in Bogota and in other parts of the country. Nothing came up after the protests of the last year, because the government refused to dialogue with the National Strike Committee, and also with those of us in the platform Let's Defend the Peace, who have insisted in work together with the government in order to stop the killings of the social leaders. I would say you, Michael, that your question is what to do. And for me, the first issue to do, the first thing we must do, and is our duty, our obligation as a citizens in Colombia, as a political leaders in Colombia, is to work together, at least in this issue, at least to defend the life of the people, of the social leaders, of the people in these territories, which have been very affected for the violence of all kinds of violent groups. What we have to do is to work together. It has been impossible because I could say you that in the platform Let's Defend the Peace, we have proposed the government at least 4 or 5 times to have a minimum dialogue about 1, 2, or more, maximum 3 specific issues of the implementation. It has been impossible to have a dialogue with the government because they prefer to talk about peace of legality and not peace of implementation. I hope that I hope that Adriana's talk today, and she has been talking about the integral implementation of the agreement, would mean a change of position of the government. It's the good news of this panel for the Colombian people, not only there in Washington. And I would say also finally, they are a new protest today. In the streets, a great indigenous mobilization, which we call La Minga, with more than 7,000 indigenous who travel from Cauca to Bogota. They are returning today or tomorrow to their land. It's taking place now, and the last days, Monday and Tuesday. And they have insisted to talk directly with the president, and unfortunately the president refused to do that in the last weeks. And we will have a discussion in the next weeks about the Minga and about the demands of the Minga that they are asking for more protection in their territories to protect their life, and they also are asking for the integral implementation of the peace agreement. Yesterday we have a national teacher national strike, and today we have at this moment a national strike today. Thousands of people are protesting during these days, despite the pandemic, because what they say is because the abuses of the police in the streets, especially in night and 10th of September in Bogota, the killings of the social leader, they are protesting for that, and also demanding the implementation of the peace agreement.
Thank you, Minister. We are out of time. I'm grateful that so many people are sticking with us. Vice Minister, I'm going to give you 30 seconds for a very quick response, if you'd like, and then I'm afraid we need to draw to a close this very interesting conversation. I know there's a lot to explore here, and these issues are complicated, but I think we've done hopefully a good job of delving into them. But Vice Minister, if you have a final quick comment, please go ahead.
Just 2 seconds to evoke something that a very important Liberal Party leader and president of Colombia once said: "We cannot reduce everything to semantics." Thank you.
Okay. All right. Again, thank you to you, Vice Minister, Minister Cristo, Paul Angelo, Beth Dickinson, and Renata Segura, for all of your terrific contributions to this conversation. I think we hopefully delved into the issues in a way that identified the common cause and the common concern regarding violence against social leaders, as well as some of the debates and controversies about how to respond most effectively to this challenge. And so we will stay on this issue. I'm sure all of you will as well. Want to thank again Crisis Group for partnering with us on this event, and everybody who joined us for today's conversation. Thanks, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for